past decades, the use of English has spread literally to every corner of the globe. The use of English is so widespread that it is considered to be what's called a global language. In this session, we'll take a look at the terms and concepts that go along with this idea of a global language. And then we'll take a look at whether English is indeed a global language because of its wide usage. We'll also look at the implications for any language that becomes a global language and apply these implications to English. So this is a session that really takes us into the position of English in the world today. We'll start the session by taking a look at what I call the layers of language usage, which take language usage from the individual all the way up to a global usage. Then we'll take a look at the terms and concepts that go along with the idea of a global language. We'll take a look at the criteria that may or may not make a language a global language. And then we'll take a look at the forces that actually spread the use of a language around the globe. We'll take a look at the implications for a language and its users if that language is indeed a global language. And finally, we'll wrap the session up by specifically taking a look at the English language if it is indeed a global language. Languages are simply different ways of communicating and sharing ideas. In order to really understand the full range of language use, I've come up with this idea of what I call the layers of language use. And this we can put into a pyramid. And down at the base of the pyramid, we have a unique language that every individual creates for himself or herself. This is called an idiolect. So every person, and you'll notice this if you stop and listen to people speaking, every person makes kind of idiosyncratic or individual choices about how they're going to use the language. So people have favorite words and favorite expressions, favorite ways of saying things, favorite ways of putting intonation in. So this is the idiolect layer of language use. When we get to the next layer, we get language use that smaller groups decide upon. So these are what we call dialects and creoles and pidgins. So smaller groups of people get together and make unique choices to that group for how they're going to use language. The next layer up is what is officially defined as a language. So a larger group of people get together and decide, okay, this is the standard way that we're going to communicate. These are all our grammar rules and our vocabulary and our pronunciation. At the very top of the pyramid, however, we have what's called a global language. And this is language use that literally millions and at this point in time billions of people use in order to communicate at a much greater range and with a much greater spread of communication. So this pyramid of language use really helps us to understand the choices people make in terms of the language that they use. Down at the bottom we've got very unique individual choice, and at the top we've got an enormous collective choice that people around the globe choose to use a particular language for a particular reason. There are some different terms that we need to get our heads around in order to understand this very top of the language use pyramid. And just to recall, that top of the pyramid is where millions of people choose to use a particular language for some reason or another. So we're going to take a look at the different terms that have come into use, and some of the terms are starting to disappear, but there are different terms that we use when we're talking about that top part of the pyramid. The first term that we need to understand when it comes to this widespread global language usage is the term a lingua franca. A lingua franca is a language that two or more people choose to use in order to communicate because they don't have the same first language. So for example, if I have a native French speaker here and a native Chinese speaker here, and they can't communicate in either French or Chinese because they don't understand those languages, both of them don't understand those languages, but both of them understand English. So English becomes the lingua franca in this situation. So it's a separate language that two speakers of other languages both understand, and they're going to use that language to communicate. A lingua franca is often thought of as a transactional language because those two speakers of other languages, they're going to use English, for example, for a very clear transactional purpose. It may be for a business purpose or to share information, but there's a clear reason that they're using that other language, that lingua franca. The next concept that's important is the concept of an international language. The idea of an international language is that, as the name implies, it's a language that is used across national boundaries. So the language use doesn't just stay within this country, but it goes outside of the country. There's another idea that's foundational to an international language, and that is the idea that it is possible to use a language of one country in other situations outside of that country without somehow transmitting the culture that goes with that language. And so this is foundational to the concept of an international language, but it's also the problem with it. Because research shows very clearly that it's almost impossible to separate a language from the culture that goes with it. Language use is always, always, always tied to the culture. So a language use is never culturally neutral. So an international language idea is really nice, but pulling a language away from its culture is the problem with this concept. The next important concept for our discussion is that of an international auxiliary language, or IAL. An international auxiliary language is a planned language, so it was systematically and scientifically created in order to allow people with different first languages to communicate. And the reason that we have this idea of an international auxiliary language is that by creating a planned separate language, we're not giving power to an existing language, but everyone with those existing languages is collaborating to create this neutral language that everyone else can easily learn. The classic example of an international auxiliary language, and probably the most widely used of these languages, is Esperanto. Esperanto means one who hopes. Esperanto was actually created in the 1800s, and it was created with standardized grammar, standardized vocabulary, and standardized pronunciation. And so the idea behind all of this standardization is that Esperanto would be very, very easy for everyone to learn because it was so systematic, so methodical, and so standardized. The idea of this planned, methodically created language that's easy for everyone to learn, it's a great idea. But there are problems with it. And the main problem is that this idea of a planned, systematic language completely goes against how we as human beings use language. As human beings, language is part of our soul, and it may sound a bit hokey to say that, but it is very true. Language speaks to the soul of a group of people. And when you create a planned, systematic language, there's no soul to it. And another thing that is problematic with a planned language is that it doesn't allow for creativity. As human beings, a primary function of our language use is to be creative. And when you have a planned, methodical language, you kind of take that ability to be creative out of the language. And then there's a final problem. The planned language may start out to be standardized and systematic and methodical, but over time, human beings get creative with their language use and they change it. And so even if a language starts out very planned and standardized, over time, human beings make it non-standard because of their creative application of language use. So, and we can actually see this with Esperanto. It did start out very standardized, but then over time people decided, well, I want to change this, so I'm going to do this to the language, and another person decided I'm going to do this and change this, and now there's actually different versions of Esperanto. So unfortunately, the idea of a planned, systematic, standardized, easy-to-learn language just goes against how we as human beings use language. The next concept we need to look at is the concept of linguistic imperialism. Linguistic imperialism is when language users of one language come into a location and impose their language on the natural language of that location. And we saw this a lot over the last 400 or 500 years with colonization for economic and political purposes. So the colonizing power would come into a location and literally eliminate the local language and impose their language on that location. And linguistic imperialism is the reason that Spanish is used all over the world, French is used all over the world, Portuguese is used in a significant portion of the world, and of course English. Linguistic imperialism obviously is a negative thing because you're coming into a local population and saying, your language is no good, stop using it, and they literally forbid that language to be used and use our language instead. The final concept we need to define is a global language. So a global language is a language whose usage spreads all over the world, so literally into every corner of the world, and also into every sphere of life. So into education, into science, into technology, into personal communication, into culture, and so on. So it's simply a language that just spreads and spreads and spreads and spreads all over the world. Over the centuries, different languages have spread far, far beyond their national borders. So, for example, Latin spread when the Roman Empire ruled. In the different colonial eras, different colonial languages spread to all corners of the world. So, for example, Portuguese, German, French, and Spanish, and of course English. But there are certain criteria that scholars use today in order to really determine, is a language a global language? So does it reach to every corner of the world? So we're going to take a look at what these criteria are and look at different languages today that do go beyond their national borders and decide, are these languages global languages? Here are the criteria that we're going to take a look at in order to determine whether a language today is a global language. The number of native speakers, the total number of speakers, the geographical reach of the language, how easy the language is to learn, how useful the language is, how well is the language learning process for that particular language supported, and finally, how much cultural currency does the language have? Let's start with taking a look at the number of speakers of a language as a criteria for determining if some of the languages today, including English, are global languages. When we look at the number of speakers of a language, we need to look first of all at the native speakers of the language and then the second language speakers of that language, or the people who have learned it in addition to their first language. And these two sets of figures actually tell us two different stories when it comes to the global language debate. So you'll see if we're looking strictly at the native speakers, so the number of native speakers, we've got Mandarin topping the list, with English coming next, Spanish following, Hindustani, Arabic, Portuguese, Russian, and French in that order. However, the picture does change fairly significantly when we look at the total number of speakers. Rather than just native speakers, we're looking at the total number of people who can speak this language. So the top two flip in this regard. So English comes out on top, and then that is followed by Mandarin. And then we get Spanish and French are both next, and that's followed by Hindustani, which is followed by Arabic, which is followed by Russian, and then Portuguese. So the story that we get from native speaker numbers versus total speaker numbers in terms of whether a language is a global language is a little bit different. So our top language flips between Mandarin and English when we factor in total speakers versus native speakers. The criteria of geographic reach tells us another story when it comes to looking at languages today and whether they are actually global languages. So let's take a look at a series of maps that show us the global reach of the different languages. So Chinese, as we've seen, has a large number of native speakers and also a fairly large number of second language speakers to give it the second largest total in the world. But it's really interesting when you look at the global reach because it is somewhat limited compared to some of the other languages that we're looking at. So the majority of Mandarin speakers still reside within the boundaries of China. And they've also pushed into different areas of Southeast Asia, but the global reach is not as great as some of these other languages. Spanish has a fairly large global reach when you look at its spread on a map. Spain itself is a very small country, but through colonial endeavors by the Spanish over the past few centuries, you can see that Spanish is used all over South and North America, so it does give it a fairly significant global reach. Hindustani is somewhat similar to Chinese in that the large number of speakers of the language really does come from the high population density in the Indian subcontinent. Although speakers of Hindustani have spanned the globe, it's not been done as colonial endeavors, more as individual migration. So Hindustani is a fairly similar picture to Chinese in terms of global reach. Arabic has an interesting global reach. You can see from the map that not only is it used in the Middle East, it is used all over the northern part of North Africa. And this is, once again, remnants of the colonial wars that different Arabic nations fought over the years. So we can see Arabic has a global reach far beyond its original national boundaries. Portuguese is an interesting language because Portugal itself is a very small country, but Portuguese as a language does have significant global reach because of the colonial endeavors of the Portuguese government over the past centuries. So it's got global reach into Africa, but most significantly into Brazil and South America. And there really is an interesting political issue going on with the Portuguese language because there are more native speakers of the Brazilian version of Portuguese than the Portuguese version of Portuguese. So there's a bit of a tug of war going on there in terms of who actually controls the fate, so to speak, of the Portuguese language. So Portuguese global reach really stems from its colonial past and from the significant population that's now there in Brazil. Russia's global reach obviously goes right through the entire country of Russia, which is an enormous geographical territory. And then it goes also into the countries that formed part of the previous Soviet bloc or the communist bloc. So Russian geographic reach is fairly extensive due to those two factors. French geographic reach sits somewhere between Portuguese and Spanish. Like Portuguese and Spanish, there is a colonial past to the French language that saw it move into parts of North America, a small part of South America, larger swaths of Africa and parts of Asia and Southeast Asia. However, French is an interesting language right now because the number of speakers of French is actually declining. So the number of speakers of Spanish, on the other hand, is increasing, but French is seeing a decline. So it's a little bit interesting in terms of its geographic reach. And last but certainly not least, we've got English geographic reach. And English geographic reach, when you look at the map, is pretty phenomenal. So the number of native-speaking countries and the amount of geography covered by those countries is fairly large in and of itself. So we've got most of North America, obviously the UK, and then we've got Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. But the real story with English in terms of its geographic reach is in the number of second or third or fourth language speakers of English. You'll see from the map that this does span the globe. English is reaching geographically into all corners of the world. Another factor or another criteria that comes into play in determining whether a language becomes a global language is how easy that language is to learn. It makes sense that a language that is easier to learn would be learned by more people and therefore would spread more around the world. So things that make a language easy to learn include how easy the sound system is, so is the language easy to pronounce, how clear and concise the grammar of the language is, so the easier the grammar, the easier the language is to learn. We also need to consider how standardized or consistent that grammar is. So a language with lots of exceptions would be more difficult than a language with fewer exceptions. We also need to consider the written language that goes along with that language, or the written system that goes along with the language. So the easier a written system, the easier that language is to both read and write, and therefore learn. And finally, we need to consider how closely related the language's oral system is with its written system. So if there's a good match between how we speak a language and how we write a language, that makes the language easier to learn. If we use some of the factors that make a language easy to learn and apply them to the languages we've considered, we get really interesting pictures emerging in terms of whether these languages logically should become a global language. Chinese is a really interesting one. The main factor against Chinese becoming a global language is the difficulty of its writing system. So Chinese has an ideographic writing system which is really challenging to learn. Spanish is another interesting one. Spanish has a fairly easy grammar to learn, and another really good thing about Spanish is that it has a fairly close correspondence between how it's spoken and how it's written. So the sounds and how they're represented on paper, they match pretty closely. So that does make Spanish easy to learn from that perspective. Portuguese and French are somewhat similar in terms of ease of learning for the same reasons, but they're slightly more challenging than Spanish, because there isn't quite as good of a match between the oral and the written systems. English is really interesting when it comes to how easy it is to learn. There's a lot of complaints about English for a number of different reasons. There are a couple of sounds in English that are difficult to pronounce, the TH for example, but generally English is not that challenging to pronounce. Where English's challenges do come in are in the exceptions to the rules. So There are fairly clear grammatical rules in grammar, and English grammar is, when you compare it to the grammar of other languages, is not that difficult, but it's these exceptions that do make it challenging. And the other big challenge with English is there's a fair amount of distance between how the language is spoken and then how it is represented in writing. So you'll always hear students of English complain about English spelling, for example, and this is a sign that there's a bit of a distance between how the language is spoken and how it's written. So English has some good things going for it and also some challenges when it comes to how easy it is to learn. And I can't, unfortunately, comment on some of the other languages we've been looking at, Hindustani, Russian, and Arabic, for example, because I'm not familiar enough with those languages to comment on their ease of use. But if you're familiar with those languages, have a bit of fun and use the criteria I've given you in terms of judging the ease of learning or ease of use of a language, and make up your own mind about where those languages sit in terms of how easy they are to learn. The next criteria that we can use in order to determine if a language is, should be, or could be a global language is the idea of how useful it is. A language is useful for a few different reasons. First of all, a language is useful if we can use it to express a wide variety or a wide range of ideas. So if we can talk about a lot of topics with a particular language, then it's useful. A language is also useful if we can use it in a wide variety of situations. So can we use it over here and over here and over here? Thirdly, a language is useful if we can use it to discuss very complex or complicated ideas. So the more complex the ideas that we can discuss with the language, the more useful the language is. Related to all three of these really is one key characteristic of a language, and that is how large that language's vocabulary is. So the larger a language's vocabulary is, the more we can use that language. The more we can talk about, the more situations we can use that language in. It is this criteria, the usefulness of the language, that really puts English head and shoulders above the other languages that we've talked about. English has by far the largest vocabulary of any language that's out there today. And depending on how you categorize a word, so there's different ways we can decide whether something's a word or not, and depending upon that, the vocabulary size of English ranges from anywhere from 500,000 all the way up to several million words. So the vocabulary of English is absolutely enormous, and this makes it a hugely, hugely useful language compared to any of the other languages out there. There's a very practical criteria that comes into play when we're looking at whether a language can be or should be or is a global language. And this is the criteria of access to learning that language. So the more access people have to learning that language, mostly as a second language is kind of how we're going to frame this discussion, the more it has the potential to become a global language. So if we look at things like how easy is it to access textbooks to learn that language, and audio and video, for example, how many websites are there in that language so that we can learn the language? How much access to other learning materials do we have? Also factoring into this discussion is how many teachers are there available to teach the language? How many schools are there available to teach the language? And these are all things that very practically come into play in terms of determining the reach of a language. This criteria is interesting because it lets us see some very clear and conscious political choices that nations and governments will make in terms of whether they promote the teaching and learning of their language beyond their own national borders. So we see, for example, with French, we've got Alliance Française all over the world, and this is an avenue for the teaching and learning of French that's supported by the French government. Then we also get initiatives by the Chinese government to have Chinese studies all over the world, and initiatives by the Japanese government to do the same. So governments make very conscious choices about whether they'll promote their language outside their borders. With English, we see this very consciously done by the British government. They've got an arm called the British Council, which promotes the use of English and English culture all over the world. And the U.S. State Department funds similar initiatives through government funding as well. English is once again fairly far ahead of the other languages in terms of the availability of teaching and learning materials. The teaching and learning of English is a multi-billion-dollar industry globally, and we see this reflected in the sheer number of people who are learning English all over the world. There are more people learning English than there are native speakers of English. estimates are that at any given time there's over 1 billion people learning the English language. So this is a really interesting criteria once again because it shows you a practical side of making a language a global language. The last criteria that comes into play when we're looking at whether a language is already a global language or whether it has the potential to be a global language is something that we call cultural currency. We've already looked at the fact that language and culture go hand in hand. In fact, it's impossible to separate the language from the culture that it goes with. And logic would dictate that the more powerful the culture that goes with the language, the more powerful the language itself. And this is generally true. And so the idea of cultural currency is the idea of how much cultural material can people get access to if they learn the language. So how much music, how much art, how many movies, how many TV shows, and so on can people access if they learn the language. And once again, we see the power of the English language in this regard. So all of the culture that goes with the English language has enormous power behind it, and this in turn lends power to the English language. And related to the idea of cultural currency is simply the idea of how popular or fashionable it is to learn a language. So if culturally it's fashionable or trendy or whatever to learn a language, that language then has more power and more cultural currency. Let's take a specific look at the English language using these characteristics of a global language. And then you can decide if you think English should be categorized as an actual global language. So there are a large number of native speakers of English. So there's a large number of speakers. It's not the most spoken language from a native speaker perspective. That title belongs to Mandarin. There are a lot of native speakers. Where English really does come through as a global language is in the number of second, third, and fourth language speakers. So that number of people who've learned English in addition to their first language really bumps English to the top in terms of the number of speakers. English also has a very, very wide geographical reach. It is used in some instances in almost every single country in the world, and it's used in science, technology, business, diplomacy, and so on. So English has a very, very wide geographic reach. In terms of ease of use, the jury's kind of out on the English language. There are some things about English that are very easy to use and easy to learn. So the English sound system is not that challenging, and the English grammatical system also is not that challenging. English has a few problems when it comes to exceptions or lack of standardization in the grammar. So there's a rule, but there's also 2 or 3 exceptions to the rule. So that's a bit of a challenge. And the other real challenge with English is there is some distance between how we use the language orally and then how it is represented in its written form. And we really see this in the English spelling system, where how we say a word doesn't really make sense in terms of how it's written. So the jury is out in terms of how easy English is to learn as a language. The jury's not out, however, in terms of the usefulness of the English language. Because English has such an enormous vocabulary, we can use it to discuss any range of topics. We can go into a great deal of complexity when we're discussing things, and we can use English in almost every situation. So English usefulness is a really, really strong argument for its position as a global language. The learning of the English language is also really, really strongly supported by both government and for-profit organizations. So there are a lot of really great materials out there, textbooks, internet sites. There are a lot of great teachers, highly qualified teachers. There are a lot of schools out there. So a lot of support has been given to the English language to make learning it accessible to as many people as possible. The English language also does have a lot of cultural currency behind it. So there are a vast number of movies, TV shows, music, art, all of the cultural currency that nations and cultures put out there. There's a lot of power behind that. All of those cultural elements produced in the English language are highly popular and highly accessed by people all over the world. So English does have a lot of cultural currency, and it's a very trendy or fashionable language to study. So there's a lot of reasons that we could categorize English as a true global language. I won't tell you what to think about this. You can make up your own mind, but there is a lot of evidence there that would allow us to position it as a global language. In terms of the global language position of the other languages that we've used to compare and contrast, I don't know enough about their situations, so I'm not going to tell you, yes, this is a global language, or no, it isn't. If there's a particular language that we've talked about that you're really interested in, do your research and take a look at how that language is positioned in terms of the characteristics of a global language that we've talked about, and then come to your decision about that language. Just because a language has some of the characteristics, or even all of the characteristics of a global language, that doesn't mean it's actually going to become a global language and remain a global language. Because there are forces at play that help to position a language for the global stage. And there's forces that push that language usage beyond its own natural national borders or regional borders. So we're going to take a look at these forces so that you can further understand the dynamics that go into creating a global language. Here are the forces that help to push a language onto the global stage and can make it become a global language. So trade and commerce, so anything business related or economics related. Military forces, any military excursions or conquests and so on. Colonial forces, so trying to acquire territory and bringing those territories under the rule of a specific country. Religious forces, so the spread of a religion. Political and ideological forces. Okay, so we would see this, for example, through the spread of capitalism or the spread of communism, to use two contrasting examples. Diplomatic forces, so we negotiate in a particular language or to have a particular language be used. Cultural forces, so any push to move the culture beyond national boundaries. Technological forces, this is a huge one. Particularly today, we see technology facilitating the move of languages beyond borders. Migratory forces, we also see this in action today, where groups of people move from one region to another, and then they take their language with them. And finally, population growth. So if the number of native speakers of a language just grows through natural means, obviously that's going to help position a language as a global language. Let's take a look at some of these forces as they've acted upon the languages we've been discussing so far in this session. I am by no means an expert on any of these languages or the histories of the countries or the languages themselves, so I'll just give you a general indication of some of the forces that were probably at play. And if you're interested in a specific language, that's your opportunity to do more research on your own. The Latin language started in Italy, and it spread beyond the borders and the regions of Italy, mostly through military action. So the main force that pushed Latin beyond its normal regional and national borders were military forces. There were also some religious forces that got into the action there. When Rome converted to Catholicism, the Latin language was once again pushed out into a lot of different areas. So with Latin, we see military forces at work and also religious forces at work. Several different forces have contributed to the spread of Arabic beyond its original boundaries over the past centuries. So hundreds of years ago, Arabic speakers were great traders, so they spread out by both land and sea to trade and brought their language with them. Another force, very obviously, is the close ties that Arabic has with Islam. And so as Islam was spread, the Arabic language was also spread. And finally, military action also led to the spread of Arabic. Over different centuries, different powers were in place that used Arabic as their native language, and they therefore spread the language as they conquered different territories. Portuguese, Spanish, and French all spread beyond their initial region or national boundaries through colonization. So all of these European powers fought to acquire different colonial territories all over the world and brought their languages with them. A couple of interesting things have changed their positions in the world today, however, on the global stage. With Portuguese, even though obviously there's no colonization going on anymore, there is a lot of natural population growth going on in Brazil. So that has given renewed strength to the Portuguese language. So Portuguese initially spread through colonization, and now it is growing, or its use is growing, through population growth. French, on the other hand, really only spread as a result of colonization, and they don't have any natural population growth going on at this point in time to continue the push of the language beyond its borders. So this is one of the reasons, or the main reason, that we're seeing a decline overall in the usage of French, is that obviously colonization is no longer a force pushing it out into the world. Spanish is also in a similar position to Portuguese. So initially it was put out into the world through colonization, some military conquests, and now it is really pushing through population growth. Another interesting thing about Spanish, it's moving through the United States and continental North America through migration. So a current power behind Spanish, as well as the population growth, is also migration. So three colonial languages, which today are in very different positions because other forces for growth have taken over. Russian is an example of a language that was primarily spread through political and ideological means. So as communism took root in a lot of different countries, the Russian language followed. Obviously, there was also military action that accompanied that political and ideological force at work. So those two, the military, political, and ideological together, really pushed the use of the Russian language out into the world and far beyond the Russian borders. Hindustani and Chinese are examples of languages that have seen their main growth come through a natural force of population growth. There has been some push of these languages beyond their regional borders through trade and commerce, but they've never actually taken over entire countries and imposed a language on those countries. So the impact of that force is not as great. There is some debate about Chinese, and it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out over the next few decades. There's debate now, given the strength of the Chinese economy, it's challenging for the #1 economic power position in the world, whether this will push Chinese further onto the world stage and make Chinese overtake the position currently occupied by English. So the Chinese language will be a really interesting one to watch over the next few decades. And then we come to the English language, and this is really interesting. The English language is in its current position because it's had many of these different forces working on it in waves or sometimes at the same time. So with the other languages, their growth pushed beyond regional boundaries through one or two main forces. English has had a lot of different forces acting on it, which is the main reason that it has gotten to its current position of prominence. So English had trade and commerce behind it. One of the most powerful economies used to be the UK, and now the most powerful economy is the United States. It had military forces, so British military actions, American military actions. It had colonial forces behind it. It still currently has huge cultural forces behind it to supplement the economic forces. There's a lot of migration forces going on. There are some population growth forces going on. So English is really interesting because it's in its current position, not because of one or two main forces that took it there, but because of multiple forces that have just continually kept pushing it more and more upon the global stage. There's a really great video available on YouTube that takes you through the history of the English language and allows you to see all of these different forces at work on the language in turn. So it takes you through the cultural forces and the colonial forces and the trade and economic forces that just continually pushed English onto the world stage. It's a really fun video. There's a few rude parts here and there, so just if you get offended by those, sorry. But it's a great little clip to really quickly help you understand the action of these forces on the English language that have pushed it onto the global stage and created the global language that it is today. My conclusion from all of this discussion is that English really is a global language. Some people will argue that no, it's not, and that we haven't really yet seen a true global language today, and that maybe that will happen in the future. But my money is on English being a global language. When you look at the criteria for making a global language, when you look at the forces that have taken English to where it is today, I am firmly on the side of the debate that says English is indeed a global language. So if we say that English is a global language, and I do say this personally, but you're free to disagree with me, there are implications for a language when it becomes a global language. And some of these implications are actually not all positive. So the positive ones, obviously, is that the language is extremely vigorous, it's creative, there's a lot of change happening to it, and it's always current and cutting edge. So it's a very vibrant language simply because there's so many people speaking it, and it's being used in so many different situations. And this is where English really is at. It's a wonderful, interesting, creative, vibrant language. On the other hand, some interesting things happen when so many people are speaking a language because there are so many forces of change acting on that language. So here are some interesting implications for both native and non-native speakers of English. The first implication is that when a language becomes a global language, there are actually more second, third, and fourth speakers of the language than there are native speakers of the language. And that's the situation we currently have today. There are more people who have learned English on top of their first language than have learned English as their first language. And so this brings up an issue of who controls the language. So who decides what the standard for the language is? So is it the native speakers because, hey, they learned it as their first language and therefore it's their language? Or is it the second, third, and fourth speakers of the language who have learned it and now have decided to use it maybe in slightly different ways? So the idea of ownership of a global language really becomes quite interesting. Is it owned by the native speakers of the language, and are they the ones who set the standard, or is it owned by all the other speakers of the language, and are they the ones that set the standard? Another interesting implication for English as a global language is the possibility that because there's so many different speakers of English, and each group of speakers is using English in a slightly different or unique way, and there's different forces acting on the language in different regions of the world, we get the possibility that we'll create many different dialects of English, and over time, these dialects may actually become mutually incomprehensible. And we saw this with Latin. So Latin's a really good example of this process at work. So Latin started out as one language, but then it spread, and then over time, in each region where it was used, it developed into a distinct language, and these languages became mutually incomprehensible. So there is the possibility that this will happen with English. And we're starting to see this already when in different parts of the world where we do have different dialects of English developing. So let's take a look at those. So a concept has developed with English's prominence on the global stage, and this concept is the concept of world Englishes. So there's not just one English, but there are multiple Englishes. And these Englishes can be arranged in concentric circles. So in the middle, we have what are called our primary Englishes. So these are countries where native speakers reside. So this is, for example, the UK, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So these are the primary Englishes. And then around that, our next concentric circle, we have the secondary Englishes. These are the Englishes in countries or regions of the world where English has had a presence for quite a long time. And so a fairly distinct dialect in these regions has also developed, but they're not necessarily considered as native, so to speak, or as prestigious as the primary Englishes. So examples of this would be Englishes found in the Indian subcontinent, for example, where English has had a presence for a very long time, and there is a very distinct Indian dialect of English, for example. And then the final concentric circle we've got are what are called the tertiary Englishes. And these are dialects or versions of English that have developed more recently. So these are in regions of the world that English has more recently made inroads into. So for example, this would be your Korea, your China, and so on, where English is gaining some traction and this unique dialect or version of English is developing. The concept of world Englishes and these three concentric circles really does help us document or articulate the spread of English from a core set of countries out into more and more countries in the world. Some people do argue with this model, however, because there is an implied level of prestige with the different varieties of Englishes. So the primary Englishes are given more prestige than the secondary, which have more prestige than the tertiary. So there's some status jockeying going on here with this model, but it does really help us understand how one language can move into different dialects and versions as it spreads throughout different regions of the world. We can see this spread and these primary, secondary, and tertiary languages at work when we look at the level of language proficiency in the world mapped onto an actual map of the world. So you can see the areas where there are primary Englishes, where there are secondary Englishes, and where there are tertiary Englishes. This is very powerful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it allows us to see these concentric circles in action. And second of all, it once again just illustrates the spread of one language around the globe. There's one last thing to keep in mind when you're looking at this map of the different versions of English, the primary, secondary, and tertiary. And that is, this map represents the presence of unique versions of the language that exist. So for example, in Europe, particularly Western Europe and Scandinavia, English is very widely used and the level of fluency is very high. However, a unique dialect or a unique version of the language has not developed. The language that's spoken, or the English version spoken, is primarily a British English with some American influences. So there is no secondary or tertiary presence of a World English in Western Europe or Scandinavia. However, in other regions of the world, a unique version of English is developing, and this is where we get the secondary or tertiary versions of the language being developed. And I lied, there's one other point to keep in mind. Remember, the classification of a version of English as either primary, secondary, or tertiary is highly political. So there is this jockeying for position, and there are these political issues around whether a language is a secondary or tertiary version of English. And so the map that you see might not be the same map that other people or other organizations would produce. So this is one possible version of primary, secondary, and tertiary versions. It's not the only version, because there are other political perceptions or perspectives that might come into play when a language is designated as one of these versions of English. A language education company called EF that operates globally does a really interesting set of data gathering and analysis, and they call it the English Proficiency Index. And what this data collection and analysis allows them to do is to assign a rating of language proficiency in English to all the different countries in the world in which they operate, and it's a lot of countries. So you can see the series of maps that allow us to see the varying degrees of language proficiency throughout the world. And it also, once again, illustrates how English has spread globally. EF also uses their data to analyze English proficiency on a sector basis or an industry basis. And this is another interesting example of the widespread usage of English, and that it is more prevalent in certain sectors of the global economy than others, but it is prevalent in almost every single sector. We'll close off this session with an intriguing question. So if you believe, as I believe, that English is currently a global language, and it is the only really true global language, if we look at all the characteristics and the action of the forces, if that really is English's position now, what's the future going to look like for English? Is English going to just continue to spread and dominate, or is it going to fragment off into eventually mutually incomprehensible dialects? Or there's a third possibility, is another language going to rise up and displace English as a global language? There are a lot of proponents of the third scenario who believe that Chinese will displace English as a global language as the Chinese economy becomes more and more powerful. So there's some really interesting discussion around what is the future of the English language now that it has become officially a global language. The jury's out. I leave it to you to speculate and make your own decisions.